Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today to find out more about our recently released suicide prevention guidelines for LGBTQA plus young people. We're excited to have so many of you joining us from around the country, and we've even got a few people joining from overseas. For those of you who haven't joined on the correct link, please look in the chat. There is a new link that you need to join in. As is customary in today's age, we are always having tech difficulties. So if you haven't joined on the new link, please do so. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the panelists for today are all coming to you from the spectacular lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and thank them for their generosity and wisdom in the work that we do here at Telethon Kids Institute. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement to the lands of lands that you're all on, where you live and work, and acknowledge any Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people that are attending the webinar today. My name is Professor Ashleigh. I'm the Program Head of Mental Health and Youth at Telethon Kids Institute, and I'm delighted to be your host and moderator today. We are joined by three speakers who will be covering research, clinical and community insights related to the guidelines. Each of our speakers will speak in turn, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. Please submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as you're listening to the presenters. I'll try my hardest to get through as many of the questions as possible once the speakers have finished. Also to note that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to the Telethon Kids Institute website in the coming days, and so we'd like you to share it widely. For the people again who are just joining us on the original link, please look in the chat and join from the new link that we've published in the chat, as this incorrect link was sent out. Okay, so let's get started despite a delay of 9 minutes. Our first speaker will be Dr. Yael Perry. Dr. Perry is the co-head of the Youth Mental Health team with me at Telethon Kids Institute and a senior author on the guidelines. Dr. Perry's research is focused on the prevention of mental health difficulties in young people, and she has a particular focus on working with marginalised populations such as LGBTQA plus youth, as well as their families. Dr. Perry will provide some background in terms of the need for these guidelines, how they were developed, and an outline of what the guidelines include. Thank you. Over to you, Yael.
Thanks so much, Ashleigh, and thank you all for being here today. As Ashleigh mentioned, I'm going to start out by just providing a little bit of background to the development of these guidelines, and then I'll spend a little bit more time focused on the method and the content of the guidelines themselves. So, as many of you are likely aware, many LGBTQA plus young people lead very happy and fulfilled lives, but we also know that LGBTQA plus young people are at significantly higher risk for mental health difficulties and suicide than their cisgender and heterosexual peers. So data from the recent Writing Themselves in 4 report has shown that over a quarter of LGBTQA plus young people have attempted suicide in their lifetime, and this rate is 5 to 6 times the rate seen in the general youth population. We know from research that the key drivers of these difficulties are stigma and discrimination, but they're also compounded by inadequate access to appropriate and tailored professional support. Clinical and community-based professionals often receive inadequate training in LGBTQA plus identities and the unique needs of this population, but they mention that they really would like to have more knowledge and competence in this space. So the driver behind these guidelines was really to provide greater guidance for professionals who might work with LGBTQA plus young people who are at risk for suicide. Specifically, our aim was to develop practical guidelines that offer service providers working with LGBTQA plus young people with the skills, knowledge and competence to provide care that's appropriate, sensitive and evidence-informed. And we really want to highlight the practical aspect of this. We want anybody working in a clinical or community space to be able to pick up the guidelines and have really practical tools for implementing these recommendations. So these guidelines were developed using the Delphi consensus method, which involves expert panels rating a series of recommendations that have been drawn from the empirical literature as well as clinical practice. We began by systematically reviewing publications from the last 20 years that reported any recommendations or guidelines related to preventing suicide in LGBTQA+ young people that could be implemented in clinical and community settings. We also conducted interviews with LGBTQA+ young people who had lived experience of suicidal thoughts or behaviour. And then we collated all of this information to develop the first round Delphi survey, which actually included 270 items. We shared this survey with two panels of experts. So the first panel included LGBTQA+ young people with lived experience of suicidal thoughts or behaviour, and the second panel included professionals working with LGBTQA+ young people in clinical or community settings, as well as researchers with expertise in LGBTQA+ mental health. Both expert panels were asked to rate the importance of each of the recommendations, and the panels were also given the opportunity to provide feedback on items and to suggest any new items after the first round so that they could be included in the second round. Only the items that were endorsed as either important or essential by at least 80% of both panels were included in the guidelines. So throughout this process, we also engaged two advisory groups. There was one youth and one professional stakeholder group who oversaw the entire research process, as well as the translation of these guidelines into the community. In total, we had 115 experts participate. So in the first round, we had 52 professionals and 63 young people. And in the second round, we had 42 professionals and 50 young people. And that equates to about an 80% retention rate, which we were really pleased with. I'll just go through the process in terms of item review and endorsement. So we started out, as I mentioned, with 270 items that were drawn from the literature and clinical practice recommendations as well. And after review and rating by the expert panels, 171 of these were endorsed for inclusion in the guidelines. 47 of them were included in the second round for re-rating because there wasn't consensus between the two panels. And based on feedback from the two expert panels, we actually added 163 new items for inclusion in round two. So in total, round two listed 210 items for rating, and 119 of these items were endorsed for inclusion in the guidelines. Altogether, we ended up with 290 items included in the final guidelines. And it's worth noting that about a third of these actually came from panel member recommendations. And this highlights the strength, I think, of consensus-based research that views both practice-based and empirical evidence as equally important. I'm just going to briefly run you through each of the key sections of the guidelines. I strongly encourage you to either download a copy or order a hard copy of the guidelines so you can look through it in more detail. But I just wanted to give a little overview of what you could expect in terms of the content of the guidelines. So they're divided up into 4 sections. The first section is focused on general principles for creating an affirming and inclusive environment for LGBTQA+ young people. And this section is really going to be relevant to anybody working with young people. Statistically, about 1 in 10 young people identify as LGBTQA+, so it's very likely that this population will be represented in all services. This section provides practical recommendations for making services inclusive, both in terms of their physical environment, but also as well as their processes and their protocols. Part 2 is probably more relevant to those working in clinical settings, although it may be relevant to some people in community settings, as it's focused on how to assess and respond to risk in LGBTQA+ young people. It's worth noting that this section includes a focus on risk and protective factors that are likely to be unique to this population, but they may also exist, obviously, in conjunction with other risk and protective factors that are typically seen in the general youth population. Part 2 also includes a list of screening tools to assess suicidal thoughts or behaviours in LGBTQA+ young people. And it's worth noting here that there are no validated suicide screening tools specifically for this population, and that the tools that we've listed here in the guidelines were those that were recommended and endorsed by panel members. Part 3 of the guidelines includes considerations for specific LGBTQA plus populations. So we have one section that is focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander LGBTQA plus young people, another on neurodiverse LGBTQA plus young people, and the final section is on trans young people. And just to note here that these obviously are not exhaustive groups of intersecting populations. These specific populations were included in the guidelines because there was either empirical evidence or practice-based evidence that was sufficient to include these recommendations relevant to these population. It's by no means exhaustive. The final part of the guidelines is focused on advocacy for LGBTQA plus young people, and this is both in reference to advocating within an organisation and externally as well. We have a section on resources at the end of the guidelines, which includes a range of services, both state-based and nationally, as well as training guidelines and standards of care that might be relevant for service providers, and important dates in Australia to acknowledge and celebrate LGBTQA plus people. It's worth noting that these resources can be downloaded from the guidelines website as a standalone resource as well. Just before I finish up, I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful work of our artist for these guidelines, Oliver Vincent Reyes, who is a queer young artist from New South Wales. His website is there and he takes commissions, so please feel free to check out his beautiful artwork. And in terms of funding, I'd like to acknowledge that this work was funded by the RAIN Foundation, as well as the AMP Foundation, and an Embrace Mental Health Translation Award from Telethon Kids Institute. And finally, acknowledge our wonderful research partners at Origin and UWA. Thanks very much, and back to you, Ashleigh.
Thanks, Yael. I'm struck by how comprehensively they were developed, and I absolutely love the art. So people should get in contact with Oliver Vincent if they want more of that art. Our second speaker today is Jenny Griffiths. Jenny is a consultant clinical psychologist and associate co-director of YouthLink, which is part of North Metropolitan Mental Health Service here in Perth. And Jenny has extensive experience working clinically with LGBTQA plus young people and is committed to providing inclusive and affirmative service delivery for all young people. Jenny will highlight the importance of the guidelines in clinical and community settings and provide a step-by-step guide to implementing the guidelines in practice. Thank you, Jenny. Over to you. Jenny, we're having some trouble hearing you at the moment. No, we still can't hear you, unfortunately. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flick over to our third speaker and see if we can work out what's going on with Jenny's speaker. As I said before, I think technical issue. Now we've got Jenny.
Okay, yes, I had to switch computers and the settings are a little different. Let's go. So the guidelines are very important for services working with LGBTQA plus young people because they really emphasise the development and maintenance of service-wide culture of inclusivity, welcome and competence right across all staff. So they promote the development of shared principles, values, responsibilities and skills to be held over time and in a sense to be owned by an organisation. This is really much better for young people than relying on the commitment and skill sets of an individual staff member, which really leads to a reduced take-up of the shared responsibilities of an organisation and of course the loss of skills as staff move on. Another really valuable aspect of the guidelines is the methodology used to obtain them. So the process represented a really true partnership between LGBTQA plus young people and professionals with relevant and direct experience in clinical, community and research settings. The Delphi method has really ensured that that collaboration extended throughout the entire process of developing and refining aspects of the guidelines, making them particularly valid for LGBTQA+ young people. The guidelines provide specific how-tos to develop an affirmative and welcoming environment across a range of health, mental health and other environments. And there's great value in the provision of the practical measures to be applied across such a wide range of settings and service types, really something for everyone. And this optimises the reach across the very many settings in which LGBTQA+ young people find themselves. The guidelines also provide for consideration of the additional needs of young people experiencing intersectionality. For example, those with other aspects of their identity that can heighten their vulnerability, such as LGBTQA+ young people of Aboriginal identity, or those who experience neurodiversity, including those on the autism spectrum. This is a really important part of the guidelines, and it's often or even usually overlooked, yet so many LGBTQA+ young people do experience intersectionality. Finally, the guidelines enable best practice measures to be evaluated over time. Because of the practical and measurable nature of the guidelines, services will be able to assess their current status and plan and implement changes, measure their progress, and then determine their future needs to improve their service delivery to this highly vulnerable cohort of young people. So, how to implement the guidelines? First of all, it's really important to read through the guidelines along with the implementation guide. So download both from the Telethon Kids Institute website and read through together in order to tailor your approach to suit your own particular service. Next, you need to put together an implementation team. You may already be aware of some of the team members that you have who have a particular commitment, passion and availability to bring the recommendations to the team. So this person could be nominated as a champion to lead the processes. However, I'd really recommend aiming to find a small group of staff to act as champions, or to develop a small portfolio approach with staff who can work together to support the team throughout the changes. And having a small identified group or portfolio approach allows for a sense of a team approach to bring these positive changes to the service. And it also allows for an easier delegation of different roles and tasks along the way. Also, this type of collaboration around such an important goal is actually quite enjoyable for those involved, and much more so than if the tasks fall to a single individual on the staff. Next, it's really important to audit your service to gauge where your organisation fits in terms of the recommendations prior to beginning any change process. There could be some things that you identify, you may know or not know about already that you're doing really well. And the audit process can help you, of course, to identify areas for improvement. So the actual audit can be conducted internally within your organisation, perhaps by your portfolio group, or you may find a colleague organisation, especially one with well-developed LGBTQA+ inclusivity and competencies, which may agree to conduct the audit for you. You could even audit each other's organisations. Important areas to include in this audit review would be the physical environment, your intake forms and other documentation, current procedures, and of course, attitudes, knowledge and practices of existing staff. You could also potentially undertake an anonymous survey among service users to gauge their thoughts and feelings regarding the inclusivity and welcome and competencies of your service in supporting LGBTQA+ young people. And that measure could be used a number of times, so including before the changes are made, during the process, and then again when the recommendations have been incorporated into your organisational practice and culture. Then you move on to setting goals. So you need to decide which recommendations to implement and which ones suit your service best. So some may be more feasible or more easily achieved than others, and this will depend on your governance structures or your service type. So it could be really helpful here to choose at least one quicker win goal amongst your other goals, such as perhaps allowing for gender-free toilet and change room spaces, alongside your longer-term goals, for example, around recruitment processes, whereby LGBTQA plus young people could be supported to contribute questions to interview schedules for recruiting new staff, and could even be included on interview panels. Next, you go on to assigning tasks and setting a time frame. Roles and responsibilities can then be allocated to specific people across the team. And here again, the portfolio approach really helps to bring in and embed and support the larger team to accommodate changes, acquire their new skills, and bring these changes to a shift in the wider team culture. Obviously, timeframes need to be realistic. And this, again, will depend on your own organisational and governance structures. You'll need to closely liaise with your executive to make sure that your changes comply with organisational policies and requirements. Next is communication. So regular, effective and sensitive communication will be a really important part of change, as it is in any and all work settings. So, for example, reporting from portfolio members or champions back to full team business meetings can be really helpful in allowing staff to be aware of the changes as they're introduced and provide opportunities for concerns to be expressed, and of course give a forum for staff to contribute really valuable ideas and creative suggestions. Part of the communication strategy could and should, I think, also include celebration of your achievements along the way. And really importantly, can include any positive feedback that you receive from LGBTQA plus young people who access your organisation. Then finally, the review process. Regular evaluation at agreed intervals is really important through this change process. This may include routine audits and ongoing opportunities for current and new staff to engage in inclusivity training. Your organisation may be able to engage LGBTQA plus young people to feed into this review process, which would be great, through surveys, consultation sessions, anonymous feedback questionnaires or other means. These mechanisms of feedback directly from young people are extremely powerful means of assessing the impact of your changes, because they relate very directly to the success of your organisation in providing safe, inclusive and competent services to LGBTQA plus young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That's been really helpful in trying to understand how we might implement the guidelines into services. And as you know, there are some services who will have done many of these things, but we also assume that there are some people joining us today who are part of services who haven't really done much in the space of LGBTQA plus inclusivity, and will find that really useful. And there is a question coming up later, which I will ask about an auditing framework and how we can assist in that implementation. And final speaker for today is Charlotte Glantz. Charlotte is the co-founder and project and policy coordinator of the Youth Pride Network. And this is a group of young people who are LGBTQIA+, from across Western Australia, who are working to improve the lives of all LGBTQIA+ young people in the state through their systematic advocacy. And I will say, to their credit, they have achieved a huge amount so far, and a lot of that is thanks to Charlotte's work. Charlotte will speak about the value of these guidelines for the young people that we serve. Charlotte, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashleigh. And thank you so much for having me speak today. So yeah, hi, my name's Charlotte. My pronouns are she, they. I think that when we talk about these guidelines and we talk about service use, particularly mental health service use, The really important thing to frame this in is that LGBTQI plus young people still experience a significant amount of discrimination. And I think sometimes our allies and people who care about our community often don't necessarily understand the extent to which this discrimination still continues. Because maybe, you know, you don't feel like you discriminate and your friends would never discriminate. And so it can be, sometimes we can lose some of that perspective. But what we know from the young people we talk to is that young people are still experiencing discrimination in services, in schools, particularly in healthcare, from their families and from their broader communities that they're a part of. And as well as that kind of direct discrimination, there's also this more subtle discrimination, which is this exclusion from services, the assumption that LGBTQI plus young people aren't service users, the fact that forms and different service aspects won't be set up, the assumption that your doctor might make that your partner is of a particular gender or that you have a particular gender identity. And so I think that as a psychologist or a mental health professional, when you're seeing a young person, regardless of whether they're coming to you for something related to their identity or not, if you perpetuate that discrimination and if you perpetuate that exclusion, what you're actually doing is sort of contributing to that trauma and discrimination that young person has experienced. And so that young person is coming to you in a particular vulnerable state. And I think that young people we talk to who've had really negative experiences from service users start to develop this idea about the world that adults won't support me, adults won't accept who I am. And it contributes to a broader pattern of avoiding service use, or if they've used services and had a negative experience, it is really, really hard to get LGBTQI plus young people to re-engage. And so I think that this is why these protocols are so important and so crucial, because as a psychologist and a mental health service practitioner, you are often shaping the way that LGBTQI plus young people view not only their profession, but also kind of adults in their life more broadly. And I think that because we're so hyper aware of this kind of discrimination that's possible within services, LGBTQI plus young people kind of move through the world and move through the service landscape, assuming that all services will be discriminatory until they're proven otherwise, which I think is something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. And so that's why things in these service guidelines, particularly things around actively signaling LGBTQI plus inclusion, is so important, is because LGBTQI plus young people are actively looking for those signals that a service is safe. It's also critically important that those signals are then backed up by good service delivery. And the reason for that is that LGBTQI plus young people talk to their peers a lot. If you're in any sort of LGBTQI plus Facebook group, you will know that every week someone is posting, hey, does anyone have a good referral for a psychologist? Does anyone have a good recommendation for a GP? And that's because we're really caring about having actually someone vetted these services before we use them, because we're actively trying to avoid those discriminatory or negative experiences. So backing those active promotions with good service delivery is really critically important. And as an LGBTQI plus community, we also vet services before we recommend. So good service practitioners, and particularly LGBTQI plus service practitioners, have really, really strong referral networks and have services that they recommend young people to ensure that those young people have a good experience. But unfortunately, because that is a small number of services, that can often lead to really long wait lists on those services that actively do this really well. So that's why it's really important that all services are doing this well, so that LGBTQI plus young people are kind of able to walk into any service and expect to be treated well. I think that these guidelines are really fantastic because they, as has sort of been mentioned by a couple of other speakers, really, really take you through every single aspect of service delivery and every single aspect where young people will be assessing whether a service is inclusive. And I think that's really fantastic. I'll give you an example from my life. So I attended a GP that was recommended to me as really LGBT inclusive and brands themselves as LGBT inclusive. But then when I rocked up at the GP, and my GP is fantastic, I don't want to, no shade to my GP, but the form that I was given in the waiting room didn't have anything about pronouns, it didn't have anything about gender versus sex markers, it didn't have alternative titles that I could select other than Ms. or Mr. And so immediately I've gone in with one, I'm reassessing what type of information I'm willing to tell my doctor, and what type of my actual safety in that service, and how I'm going to present and censor myself in that service. And so even though the service had done maybe half the things right, because some of those key things were missing, it led to different perceptions and a change to my behavior as to what I disclosed. The final point that I want to make is that I think the counter to my original point is that when a service practitioner is LGBTQI plus affirming, that has an enormous impact on LGBTQI plus young people, their resilience, and their perspectives on the world. And we know this because we talk to queer young people who've had really fantastic experiences with service practitioners. And I remember one story of someone who had a really, really fantastic youth worker. And because they had that really fantastic youth worker, they said that when I go to school and I have a really bad experience with my teachers, and when I go home and I have a really bad experience with my family, I know, and I can put that into perspective, that that's only those institutions, and that's just those people and their problems. Because I have this fantastic youth worker who shows me that actually there are adults who accept my identity, and there are people who are going to take the time to understand who I am in my life. So I think that the counterpoint of obviously not wanting to add to or compound LGBTQI plus young people's trauma, the counterpoint to that is that you can have an incredibly positive influence on how that young people views the world and views supportive adults in their life by doing this implementation of these policies. So I really want to commend the Telethon Kids Institute for these guidelines. They're absolutely fantastic. And I think that hopefully what these will do is allow us to stop seeing LGBTQI plus young people as an optional extra, but seeing them as a really core part of service delivery.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was fantastic to hear the perspective of young people. And what strikes me most about that is that young LGBTQA plus young people, they do talk. And if you want your service to maintain a reputation as a friendly and safe space, then you do need to implement these guidelines. Charlotte, I'm actually going to throw the first question to you because you said something that I just thought you could maybe expand on a little bit. What I would like to know from you, you spoke about a fantastic experience at a clinical service. Can you tell us what a fantastic experience looks like to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a fantastic experience at a clinical service is one that has taken into and done this sort of thinking that is kind of outlined in this guideline. So you can see that they have an awareness of the way that LGBT young people experience service delivery and have kind of tried to cater to that. So in practical terms, I think there's some really practical things set out in the guidelines, but that includes actively affirming LGBTQI plus young people on the promotion of the website and speaking about the qualifications and training of staff. It looks like having really inclusive forms. It might look like if you go into YouthLink, which is Jen's service, and you look on the waiting room, there's heaps of posters of LGBTQI plus young people and different issues and stuff, and it shows that staff have an active awareness. And then fourthly, I think that staff have the required sort of training and understanding, or have the willingness to learn and understand LGBTQI plus communities and stuff. I think that yeah, are able to kind of come with that empathy.
Great, thanks so much, Charlotte. That's really good insights for all the people who are here, who are service providers and trying to learn from the young people with lived experience. I'm going to flick my next question to Yael because there's a question here about an auditing framework. So Justin asked, do the guidelines have an auditing framework or guideline, and what should be included in terms of auditing performance of a service?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really good one. I think originally we didn't plan to develop an auditing framework, and partly that was because of the broad applicability of these guidelines. We are hoping that the guidelines will be used in a whole range of services, from clinical and community settings, education settings, police. There's a whole range of relevant settings where these might be used. And because of that, we felt like auditing would probably need to happen at the organisation level. We have had feedback since the guidelines have been released from a few people that this might be helpful. And I think the idea of a framework rather than a really sort of specified plan of what should be included would be helpful given the feedback that we've received. And it's something that we're looking into developing now, that just to give organisations sort of something to plan their own audit for their own organisations, obviously understanding what the specific needs of the organisations are and the capacity and their aims, but to provide a little bit more structure to make sure that those recommendations and guidelines can be put in place in a comprehensive way.
Thank you, Yael, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing something similar to that in the future. My next question, I just want to remind everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A chat. We have a little bit of time for a few more questions, so I just would encourage everyone to ask any questions that you might have. Jenny, somebody's asked what the, in this context, what neurodiverse refers to, and maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So neurodiversity refers to different wiring, I guess, neurological wiring that people can experience. There's controversy about whether different neurological wiring may be disordered or actually just variations on the full range of how different we are as humans. And I tend to prefer that. But the specific types of I guess, characteristics of people who may come under neurodiversity would include people with ADHD or ADD, or people on the autism spectrum. So, and I guess people on the autism spectrum are perhaps the most usually referred to as neurodiverse, and amongst the varying communities of people who identify as being on the autism spectrum, they often quite like the use of the term neurodiverse or neurodivergent, and they would describe other people, some of them, as neurotypical. So I hope that provides some sort of a framework if that term's not familiar to some people.
Thanks, Jenny, and I hope that whoever asked that question found that useful. Yael, somebody's asked if they could hear more about how you partnered with the Youth Advisory Group. Maybe you could tell people a little bit more about that.
Sure. So we at Telethon Kids already have a fairly extensive network of partnerships in terms of advisory groups. We like to draw on lived experience in all of the research that we do here within our team. And we felt it was really important to have an advisory group involved in the development of these guidelines and I guess the oversight all the way through to the translation process. So we engaged, we put out a call for advisory group members, for both the young people and stakeholder advisory group members. Jenny was on our stakeholder advisory group as well. And essentially what we did was we engaged with both groups independently, initially at the item development stage, to get some feedback on the items that we plan to include in the survey. And then after the endorsement process was over, we just went back to both the youth and the stakeholder advisory panels to get their insights around the items that had been included. And interestingly, neither group actually added any additional items. There was some additional sort of clarification and context provided to some of the items, but there was endorsement and consensus amongst the advisory group members as well. And then finally, we consulted with both the youth and the stakeholder advisory group panel around translation of these guidelines. We were always very clear that we didn't want this to simply be an academic output, and that we wanted to be something very practical that would be used in the community. And so we've consulted with both young people and the stakeholders to make sure that whatever our translation strategy was really going to result in the greatest impact and uptake of the guidelines. Hence this webinar. We've had a social media campaign. We've done some direct targeting of organisations to send them out. And we're listening to the community about what they want as well. So, for example, the auditing framework is on our list of things to develop to ensure the practical utility of the guidelines in the future.
Thank you, Yael. We've had quite a lot of questions about the use of the LGBTQA+ acronym. Some people have asked what is the best use of the acronym, and if it is used in so many different ways. So perhaps I'll flick to Charlotte for the answer to this one first, and then maybe back to Yael after that. Charlotte?
Yeah, I think that we get this a lot. The standard is probably LGBTQIA+. The importance of, you're probably familiar with LGBT. I think the importance of the QIA is specifically recognizing queer, intersex and asexual people, or aromantic people as well. And then I think the plus is just to sort of cover your bases. I think that is important. That's my recommendation. I think there's a pretty good reason to do that. I'd also say that that's not, don't get stuck on that. I would say that's not the most important thing. And I think that if you're using the quote unquote wrong acronym, but you're still genuinely showing that you have an understanding of queer communities and what all those letters mean, and that's probably more important than necessarily getting I think people get stuck on the acronym a bit.
Yep, thanks for that, Charlotte. I think that's absolutely true. It's about the intention behind how you use the acronym rather than exactly which letters you're using. I'm just going to flick to Yael for a second here, because there have been a few questions about why the I. So the I is for intersex. We're not included in the acronym within the guidelines. And Yael, maybe you could speak to that for a moment.
Sure. Yes. And look, I would agree with Charlotte that, technically the full acronym, including the I, is best practice. We're quite intentional about the letters that we include when we put out research, and specifically around the experiences of intersex individuals, because typically the I is included and doesn't always reflect the experiences of intersex individuals within the research that's actually been conducted. So we did include intersex people in our systematic literature search, and there was no relevant research at all in this space. So I think that there's two take-home messages here. One, we desperately need some research to indicate what is appropriate inclusive practice and suicide prevention for intersex young people. Secondly, we didn't feel like it was genuine to include the I if there was no representation of intersex people within the literature or within the practice-based recommendations. And we do actually speak to this in the guidelines. And in our resources section, we refer interested people to Intersex Human Rights Australia, which is a fantastic organisation that provides a lot of information and support to intersex individuals as a starting point for accessing that kind of information, acknowledging that it wasn't specifically included within these guidelines.
Thanks, Yael. And someone has asked what is intersex, and I will refer you to the glossary of terms that are in the guidelines, where you can learn more about the different terms and what they mean. I'm thinking about Jenny talking about the implementation and having an implementation group. One of the questions that I have, Jenny, was about whether this needs to be people who identify as LGBTQA+, but also I guess this relates to what somebody else has put in one of the question was, how can organisations attract LGBTQA+ employers to their organisations? Because really, we need people who identify in the same way to be serving our young people. Maybe you've got a few reflections on that.
Yes, I don't think that the group of or the champions or the portfolios necessarily have to identify as LGBTQA+, but I think they really absolutely have to be allies. They really have to have Their heart has to be in this. So I think that's really, really important. It's great if you have staff who identify as LGBTQA+, who would like to be part of the group. I think that's absolutely brilliant. But I think just to sort of join with the second part of that question, one of the advantages, it's almost a side effect, but a very positive one, of taking up these guidelines, is that by making your workplace safe for your young people, you are making it safe for your staff as well. So staff who are LGBTQA+, who may not be able to feel comfortable being out with their identity, and they may not feel that it's a safe environment, this makes it safe for everyone. So you probably already have LGBTQA+ people on your staff if you have an organisation of any considerable size, and some of those people may be comfortable with their identity being open in the workplace. But this is a really great way to make a workplace absolutely great for everybody to be able to speak openly about, for example, you know, where they went with their partner on the weekend, or bring partner to events, and all of those things where they, you know, and I've really noticed this being part of an organisation over a few decades now, that you know, the people have commented that they do feel safe with their identity. And I think I'm not saying we had it all right way back then, but I think as we've gone along our journey, we've made it continuously more safe. And I just think it's a fantastic benefit of introducing the guidelines, because it's really for everyone. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Absolutely does, Jenny, and I would have given a similar answer to that. I think it was really well articulated. Somebody has asked if there's any applicability of these guidelines to school environments, or whether there's anything for schools out there. I don't know who should answer that. Possibly Yael. I might flick that one to you. Well, Charlotte might have some answers to that one as well, I think.
Well, Charlotte, if you want to speak to schools specifically, go for it. I was going to speak more generally as to other ways that we are making sure that inclusive practice is happening. But if you want to speak to schools specifically, then go ahead.
Oh yeah, awesome. So I think that definitely this does have a lot of relevance to schools, and particularly I think in terms of the implementation approach is definitely something that schools can consider. And some of the other things, particularly around identifying different factors around suicidality. If you're a school worker, you're probably not going to be doing it to that level of clinical depth, but understanding those different risk factors, I think, is really important. And something you know about schools is that young queer people often don't get risk assessed the same way. I would also say in terms of other resources, there's heaps, there's so many. And I think that Minus 18 has some Youth Pride Network. We've got a couple of different pages where we've collated a bunch of different resources. We will be coming out with a report later this year, sorry to plug that, on LGBTQI+ young people's experiences in schools in WA, but no, there's tons of stuff out there for schools. And I think that learning to go and do your own research on some of these topics is really important as part of developing your practice with these LGBTQI+ communities.
Thanks, Charlotte. Did you want to add anything to that, Yael?
I actually think Charlotte covered that really nicely. So I think we'll leave it there, just so that we might have time for one different question before we finish up.
Yeah, so I'm going to just start off with the last question that we're going to be able to ask. What I will say is that what we will try to do is answer the questions that have been put on the Q&A and attach them to the recorded webinar, so that if you find that we haven't got to your question, then you can go over there and find the answer to it there. There are a lot of questions, and I'm not able to answer all of them. Just the last question was, we've spoken about people who are already qualified as clinicians and who are already, you know, working in the field. But what strikes me is that, as far as I know, university courses are not giving giving much time and energy to LGBTQA plus inclusivity in their health courses, in their learning. I just wondered if there was any plans for translating these findings into tertiary education professional courses such as medical schools and nursing. Yael, you're probably best to answer that one.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and that is absolutely high up on our agenda. So what I would say is that we aren't planning to directly translate these guidelines into those tertiary training programs, but we do actually have funding applications in at the moment. So cross your fingers for that it gets funded and we can make it happen, to actually develop LGBTQA plus inclusive practice training for health professionals. So specifically for tertiary level medical and psychology professionals as a starting point, with the view to expanding that into other health and community trainees as well. We know it's very, very clear in the literature that community and clinical professionals are not getting adequate training in LGBTQA plus identities and health needs, but they do want it and they would like to be more confident and competent to work with this population. And so I'm working personally with some universities and education specialists with plans to develop some training programs that we can implement in tertiary settings so that we have a new generation of health professionals emerging that already have this knowledge, in addition to the ones that are already in the workforce and can access some of these sort of practical tools and recommendations from the guidelines.
Thanks, Yael. And I'd just like to congratulate the team on this this piece of work, because what it is for me is research that is imminently translatable into practice and can make a real difference in young people's lives. And it's a really testament to you that you've done this piece of work that we hope will have a really positive impact. So that was our final question for today. I'd like to thank Yael, Jenny and Charlotte for sharing their insights with us, and thank all of you for attending today. I hope that you found it informative and enjoyable. For those of you who haven't already accessed a copy of the guidelines, please head to the Telethon Kids website and you can search for Suicide Prevention Guidelines LGBTQA plus young people. There you can download a copy, and you can also request a hard copy, which these look absolutely beautiful. So we're able to send those out to you. As I said before, the recording will be posted on the same page where you can download the guidelines. Within the coming days, we will endeavour to answer the questions that we didn't get to today. There were some really good questions around how people can get these out to the people who need them most, and I think Yael would be delighted to answer those. I'll also remind you that you can always contact Yael. I think her details are somewhere on the website or on the guidelines if you have any questions that have left unanswered for today. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.